The conference room on the 14th floor smelled like leather and old paper. Margaret Thornhill sat with her hands folded on the mahogany table, staring at the lawyer's mouth as he spoke words that made no sense. Her brother David had gone pale. Their younger sister Claire was crying, but not the way Margaret expected. Not like someone who'd been cheated, like someone who already knew. The inheritance had been approved 3 weeks ago. The estate valued at $4.2 million. The family home in Westchester, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, everything ready to transfer. The lawyer had called it a formality. That final meeting. "Sign here," he'd said on the phone. "Collect your father's legacy." But the will he placed in front of them that morning wasn't the one they'd reviewed 6 months earlier when their father was dying. This one had been signed 4 days before the money was released. 4 days before their father's assets moved from probate into distribution. Someone had gotten to him in those final days. And Claire wouldn't look Margaret in the eye. "Let me take you back 8 months. Back to when none of them knew this was coming." Raymond Thornhill had his first stroke on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He was 71 years old. A retired pharmaceutical executive who'd spent 40 years building what he called a proper foundation for his children. He collapsed in his garden in Scarsdale, pruning roses he'd planted the year Margaret was born. The doctors at White Plains Hospital gave him 6 months, maybe less. The stroke had damaged his motor functions and his speech, but his mind was sharp. Too sharp, Margaret would later think. Sharp enough to be worked on. Sharp enough to be convinced. Raymond had 3 children. Margaret was the oldest at 43, a corporate attorney in Manhattan with 2 teenagers and a mortgage that reflected her Upper East Side zip code. David was 40, unmarried, working as an architect in Brooklyn with a practice that barely broke even most years. Claire was 36, the baby, the one who'd never quite launched. She'd moved back to Westchester 5 years earlier after a second divorce, living in a small rental 20 minutes from their father's house. The first will had been straightforward. Raymond's estate would be divided equally among the 3 of them, with a few specific. His coin collection to David, who'd helped him organize it as a child. His first edition books to Margaret, who'd inherited his love of Steinbeck and Hemingway. A small trust for Claire's daughter, Emma, Rima's only grandchild, besides Margaret's 2 boys. The house would be sold, and the proceeds split evenly. The investment accounts, accumulated over decades of careful planning, would be divided the same way. Each child would receive approximately $1.4 million after taxes and fees. Margaret remembered the day they'd all sat in Raymond's study, reviewing the documents. It was April, and her father's hand shook as he held the pen. "I want you to know I love you all the same," he'd said. His voice slurred from the stroke, but unmistakable in its sincerity. "I worked hard so you'd all be taken care of, so none of you would struggle like I did." Raymond had grown up poor in the Bronx, the son of a postal worker who died of a heart attack at 50. He'd put himself through City College, then pharmacy school, then climbed his way into pharmaceutical management through sheer persistence and 80-hour weeks. He'd always been obsessed with security, with making sure his children had what he called a cushion. That first will felt like Raymond. Careful, equal, fair. The kind of document a man writes when he wants to prevent exactly what would eventually happen. They'd all signed acknowledgments that they'd reviewed it. David had seemed relieved. His architecture practice had been struggling since the recession, and the inheritance would let him finally stop taking jobs he hated just to pay rent. Margaret had been quietly grateful, though her lawyer's salary meant she needed it less than her siblings. And Claire had smiled and hugged their father and said, "You've always been so good to us, Dad." That was in April. By June, Claire had moved into Raymond's house. The decision happened gradually, or at least that's how Claire presented it. Raymond needed help, she explained. He couldn't drive anymore, could barely dress himself. The home health aides were expensive and impersonal, rotating through on 8-hour shifts, never learning his preferences, his routines. "I can take care of him," Claire told Margaret over the phone. "I don't have a demanding job. Emma's in school all day. It makes sense." Margaret had hesitated. "Are you sure? That's a lot to take on. We can afford better care. He doesn't want strangers, Maggie. He wants family. He told me yesterday He feels like he's being processed, like he's already dead. The guilt had worked, of course. It had. Margaret was in court 40 hours a week. David was trying to save his business, and Claire was offering to give their father something they couldn't. Constant presence. Time. The last months of attention he deserved. Okay, Margaret had said, but we split any expenses, and if it gets too hard, we hire professionals. Deal. Deal. Claire moved in the first week of June. She took the guest bedroom on the second floor, down the hall from Raymond's master suite. She organized his medications, learned to prepare the soft foods he could still swallow, set up a schedule for his physical therapy. On the surface, it looked like devotion. Marguerite visited every Saturday. David came by. On Sundays, they'd find their father in his chair by the window, Claire hovering nearby, attentive and tired-looking. She'd lost weight. She wore sweatpants and no makeup. She looked like someone sacrificing herself for family duty. She's been wonderful, Raymond would say, his words coming slow and thick. Don't know what I'd do without her. Margaret had felt grateful, guilty for not offering first, relieved that someone was handling the daily deterioration of watching their father fade. She didn't see the smaller changes. Not at first. Claire had always been the family's afterthought, the pretty one, their mother used to say, as if beauty were compensation for everything else. She'd barely graduated high school, had drifted through community college without finishing. Her first marriage at 22 had lasted 3 years. Her second at 31 had lasted less. She'd worked retail jobs, restaurant jobs. One spent 6 months selling makeup at Nordstrom before getting fired for attendance issues. Their mother had died when Claire was 23. A brain aneurysm that took her in minutes while she was gardening. Margaret had always wondered if that loss hit Claire hardest. She'd been so young, still living at home, the baby who never quite grew up. Now, she was 46 years old, divorced twice, living in a rental she could barely afford, raising a daughter on her own. The inheritance wasn't just money to Claire. It was rescue. That's what Margaret would think later. Anyway, when she was trying to understand, when she was trying to make the cruelty make sense, in July, Margaret noticed that Claire had hired a new lawyer to review Raymond's estate plan, just making sure everything's in order. Claire said when Margaret asked, "Dad wanted me to check since I'm here every day. You know how he worries." In August, Raymond started talking about fairness, about how Claire was giving up her life to care for him, about how maybe the will should reflect that sacrifice. "She's here every day, Maggie," he said during one of Margaret's Saturday visits. His speech had gotten worse. She had to lean close to understand him. She gave up her apartment, gave up her independence. "You and David have your careers, your lives. Claire put us on hold for me. We can compensate her," Margaret had said carefully. "Pay her for caregiving, that's fair. It's not about payment." Raymond's eyes had been fierce, despite the weakness in his body. "It's about recognition." About showing her eyes see what she's doing. Margaret had felt the first twist of unease then, but she'd pushed it down. Her father was dying. He was emotional. He wanted to reward the child who was with him at the end. That was natural, wasn't it? If stories like this interest you, subscribing helps you catch the next one. The first real fight happened in September. David called Margaret at work, his voice tight with anger. "Did you know Dad changed the will?" Margaret's stomach had dropped. "What?" "Claire just told me. She said Dad wanted to give her the house. As a thank you for taking care of him. She said it's already done." "That's not possible. We all reviewed the will. It's filed with the lawyer. He can't just change it on his own." "Apparently he can. She said they had the estate attorney come to the house last week. Drew up new paperwork. She said Dad was very clear about what he wanted." Margaret had left work early that day, driven straight to Westchester, walked into her father's house using her key. She'd found Claire in the kitchen, making tea, looking calm. "We need to talk," Margaret had said. Claire had turned, and for a moment, Margaret saw something in her sister's face she'd never seen before. Not guilt, not defensiveness. Something harder. "Dad wanted to update his will," Claire said simply. "He has that right. Without telling David and me? Without discussing it? He's dying, Margaret. He doesn't need permission from his children to make decisions about his own money. This isn't about permission. It's about fairness, about what he promised us. He promised you'd be taken care of. You will be, but I'm the one who's here. I'm the one changing his sheets when he has an accident. I'm the one watching him forget how to swallow. You visit on Saturdays? David visits on Sundays. I live this every single day." The argument had escalated. Margaret had demanded to see the new will. Claire had refused, saying it was between Raymond and his lawyer. Margaret had gone upstairs to talk to her father, but he'd been sleeping, and Claire had blocked the doorway. "Don't upset him," Claire had said. "The doctors said stress could trigger another stroke." Margaret had left that day shaken with anger and something deeper. Fear. The understanding that something was happening she couldn't control. She'd called the estate attorney the next morning, Mitchell Browning, the lawyer who'd handled Raymond's affairs for 20 years. He'd been professionally apologetic, but clear. "Your father called me to the house on September 12th, Browning sighed. He was lucid. He knew what he was doing. He wanted to make changes to his will to reflect Claire's caregiving." "What changes?" "I can't discuss the specifics without your father's permission or until the will is executed. But I can tell you, he was of sound mind when we met. I asked him multiple questions to ensure he understood what he was doing. He did." "Did Claire sit in on the meeting?" A pause. "She was present, yes. She'd arranged for me to come, but I spoke with your father alone for the actual signing." "For how long? I'm not sure that's... How long were you alone with him, Mitchell?" Another pause. "Perhaps 10 minutes. He tirelessly, but he was clear about his wishes." Margaret had hung up feeling sick. 10 minutes. 10 minutes to rewrite decades of planning. 10 minutes with a dying man who could barely speak. She'd driven back to Westchester that evening with David. They'd confronted Claire together this time, demanding to see Raymond, to talk to him about what he'd done. Claire had called the police. "They're harassing me," she'd told the officer, who arrived 20 minutes later. "I'm trying to take care of my dying father, and they're accusing me of manipulating him. They're causing stress that could kill him." The officer had been young, uncomfortably clearly, not wanting to be involved in a family dispute. He'd asked Margaret and David to leave, to work it out through lawyers if necessary. Not to show up unannounced again. Margaret had stood on her father's front lawn that night, looking up at the house she'd grown up in, and felt the first real stab of loss. Not of her father, not yet, but of her family, of the idea that they were people who loved each other. David had grabbed her arm. "We need to contest this. Whatever she got him to sign, we need to fight it." "On what grounds?" Dad was lucid. The lawyer confirmed it. "She isolated him. She manipulated him when he was vulnerable. You heard what she told the police? If we push, she'll make it about us trying to exploit a dying man. She's positioned herself as the devoted daughter. We're the greedy ones who showed up twice a week, so we just let her steal his estate." Margaret had looked at her brother, seen the desperation there. David needed that inheritance. His business was failing. He'd taken out loans against the expectation of his father's money. If Claire had convinced Raymond to leave her everything, or even most of it, David would be financially destroyed. "Let me handle this," Margaret had said. "I'll find a way to talk to Dad. We'll figure out what he really wants versus what she's convinced him he wants." But she never got that chance. Raymond had another stroke 3 days later. A massive one. He was rushed to the hospital and died 6 hours later without regaining consciousness. Claire had been with him at the end. Alone. The funeral was small. Raymond had wanted cremation, no service, but Margaret had insisted on at least a memorial. They held it at a funeral home in White Plains. 40 people in folding chairs, mostly Raymond's former colleagues and neighbors. Claire sat in the front row with Emma, a 15-year-old daughter. She wore black and kept her face composed. David sat stiff beside Margaret, not speaking. Margaret gave the eulogy, talked about her father's work ethic, his dedication, his love for his children. The words felt hollow. After the service, Mitchell Browning approached them in the parking lot. "I'd like to schedule a will reading," he said. "Next week, if possible. There are matters that need to be settled." "What did he do?" Margaret asked. She was too tired for subtlety. "What's in the will?" Mitch. The lawyer had glanced at Claire, who stood 20 feet away, talking to a neighbor. "I think it's best we discuss this all together. Tuesday at 10, my office." They'd agreed. Margaret had spent the next 4 days in a state of dread. She'd barely eaten, had snapped at her husband, at her sons. She'd pulled the original will from her files, read through it again and again, trying to figure out what Claire could have convinced Raymond to change. The house. Maybe she'd gotten the house. That would be worth about $800,000. Still leave plenty for Margaret and David to split. A larger share, maybe 60-40, instead of equal thirds. That would be painful, but survivable. She hadn't imagined the truth. Mitchell Browning's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in downtown White Plains. Margaret arrived early, sat in the waiting room, watching the clock. David showed up 10 minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept. Claire arrived exactly at 10, Emma trailing behind her. "I asked Emma to come," Claire said to no one in particular. "This affects her future too." They sat around Browning's conference table. The lawyer opened a folder, pulled out documents, cleared his throat. "Raymond Thornhill's last will and testament," he began, "was executed on September 12th of this year, superseding all previous wills. Raymond was of sound mind at the time of execution. I witnessed the signing along with 2 other witnesses, as required by New York law." Margaret's hands clenched under the table. "The estate consists of the primary residence in Scarsdale, valued at approximately $790,000. Investment in retirement accounts totaling $2.8 million. Life insurance policies worth $600,000. Various personal property including vehicles, jewelry, and collectibles. Total estate value is approximately $4.2 million. Browning paused, looked at each of them. Raymond directed that his estate be distributed as follows. To his daughter Margaret, his collection of first edition books, and a cash bequest of $50,000. To his son David, his coin collection, and a cash bequest of $50,000. The room went silent. Margaret felt like she'd been hit in the chest. 50,000 out of 4 million. Browning continued, his voice carefully neutral. To his daughter Claire, the primary residence, all investment and retirement accounts, all life insurance policies, and all remaining personal property. Additionally, Claire is named as executor of the estate with full discretion over the distribution timeline. David stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. That's impossible. That's not what he wanted. She manipulated him. She isolated him and manipulated him. Mr. Thornhill, I understand this is upsetting. Upsetting. David's voice cracked. She stole everything. $4 million. She convinced a dying man to cut out his other children. He did no such thing. Claire's voice was cold, controlled. Dad made his own decision. He wanted to take care of the daughter who took care of him. Margaret couldn't speak. Her mind was working through the numbers, the timeline, the impossibility of it. Her father wouldn't do this. The man who'd insisted on fairness, who'd worked his whole life to make sure all his children were secure. He wouldn't leave 2 of them with almost nothing. I want to contest this, she finally said, on grounds of undue influence. Browning nodded slowly. That's your right, but I should tell you. I have documentation of your father's mental state. He was evaluated by his physician 2 days before the will was changed. Dr. Henning confirmed Raymond was cognitively sound, and I have notes from my conversation with him. He specifically anticipated that you might contest. He asked me to include a no contest clause. What does that mean, David? David demanded. It means if you challenge the will and lose, you forfeit even the $50,000 you'd get nothing. Margaret felt the trap close. Claire had been thorough. She'd thought of everything. There's more, Browning said quietly. Rayma included a letter to be read to all of you. Together, would you like me to read it now? Margaret wanted to say no, wanted to leave, but she nodded. Browning pulled out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky, but recognizable. Her father's hand. To my children, Browning read, I know this will hurt. I know Margaret and David will feel betrayed, but I need you to understand my reasons. For the last months of my life, Claire gave up everything to care for me. She bathed me when I couldn't do it myself. She cleaned me when I lost control. She sat with me through panic attacks at 3 a.m. She held my hand when I was afraid. Margaret and David, you have successful lives, careers, financial security. Claire has struggled. I failed her when she was young. I didn't push her the way I pushed you to. I let her drift. The money will let her raise Emma without constant stress. Please forgive me. Please understand I'm trying to make things right before I die. I love all 3 of you, but Claire needs this more. Dad. The letter hung in the air like smoke. Emma was crying. Claire sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. David was shaking, and Margaret felt something break inside her chest that she knew would never heal. I'd like a copy of that letter, she said. Her voice sounded strange, distant. This is my chance to give her the foundation I should have built for her earlier. The house will give her stability, and I'd like the name of the physician who evaluated Dad's mental state, and I'd like the exact date and time the will was changed, and I'd like to know who else was in the house that day. Margaret, Claire said, don't do this. Don't do what? Try to understand why our father cut us out of his will days before he died. Why the man who spent 40 years preaching fairness suddenly decided 2 of his children deserved almost nothing. He explained why. You heard the letter. I heard words someone convinced him to write. I convinced him of nothing. He made his own choice. Really? Because from where I'm sitting, you moved into his house, isolated him from his other children, hired a lawyer, got doctors to sign off on his competence, and somehow persuaded a man with a brain injury to completely rewrite his legacy. And you did it all in 4 months. I took care of him. That's what I did, while you and David showed up for an hour a week and patted yourselves on the back for being good children. I was there every day. Every single day. So yes, he wanted to reward that. He wanted to take care of the daughter who actually took care of him. Margaret stood, looked at her sister, tried to find something familiar there, something that looked like the little girl she'd grown up with. The baby who used to follow her around, who used to cry when Margaret left for college. She couldn't find it. I'll see you in court, Margaret sighed. The next 4 months were a descent into legal warfare. Margaret hired a probate litigation attorney, a woman named Susan Carr, who specialized in contested wills. David joined the challenge. Together, they filed a petition in Westchester County Surrogate's court claiming Claire had exercised undue influence over their father during his final months. The burden of proof was on them. They had to show that Claire had isolated Raymond, manipulated him, taken advantage of his weakened mental state. They had to prove their father's final wishes weren't actually his wishes at all. It was harder than Margaret expected. Claire had been careful. She'd kept records of everything. Visitor logs showing Margaret and David had come weekly. Medical records showing Raymond had been lucid and capable. Receipts showing she'd paid for his care out of her own pocket. She'd even kept a journal. August 3rd. Susan read from a copy Claire's attorney had provided. Dad asked me today why Margaret doesn't call more. I explained she's busy with work. He said he understands, but wishes she made more time. He said work was always his excuse to, and he regrets it. She wrote that knowing we'd see it someday. Margaret sighed. They were sitting in Susan's office in Midtown, reviewing evidence. She documented everything to make herself look devoted and us look neglectful. Maybe, Susan said, or maybe she actually was devoted and you were neglectful. Margaret stared at her attorney. You're supposed to be on my side. I am on your side, which means I'm telling you the truth. A jury is going to hear that your sister gave up her life to care for your dying father while you and David visited once a week. They're going to read that letter where he explains his reasoning. They're going to see a sick old man trying to take care of his most vulnerable child. We need something stronger than she was in the house and we weren't. What about the timing? David asked. He'd been sitting quietly, looking diminished. His architecture practice had closed in November. He'd taken a job at a corporate firm, drafting office buildings he hated. Dad changed the will right before he died. Doesn't that suggest something? It suggests he was tying up loose ends, making final decisions. That's normal behavior for someone who knows they're dying. What about the no contest clause? Margaret pressed. Doesn't that show Claire knew each challenge, that she was covering her tracks? Or it shows Raymond knew his other children would be upset and wanted to discourage pointless litigation. These clauses are common in estate planning, especially when distributions aren't equal. Margaret felt her case crumbling. So what do? We dig deeper. We find something that shows Claire actively manipulated your father, a witness who heard her coaching him. Financial records showing she was in debt and needed the money. Evidence she kept you away intentionally. Something concrete. Over the next weeks, Margaret became obsessed. She subpoenaed phone records, bank statements, medical files. She interviewed Raymond's neighbors, his doctors, his physical therapist. She hired a private investigator to look into Claire's finances. And slowly, pieces started emerging. Claire had been in serious debt. Credit cards maxed out, $30,000 owed. Her rent had been 3 months overdue when she moved into Raymond's house. Her car had been on the verge of repossession. The timing of her offer to care for Raymond suddenly looked different. Margaret also found something in the phone records. The day before Raymond changed his will, Claire had made 3 calls to Mitchell Browning's office. Then she'd called Dr. Henning. Then she'd called a notary public. She'd been arranging witnesses, setting up the pieces. But the most damaging evidence came from Raymond's neighbor, a woman named Patricia Drummond, who'd lived next door for 30 years. I saw them arguing, Patricia told Margaret's investigator. It was late August, maybe early September. I was in my garden and heard shouting from Raymond's house. The windows were open. It was Claire's voice. She was saying something about deserving more, about how she'd given up everything. Raymond said something I couldn't hear, and then Claire said, "If you don't take care of me, I don't know what I'll do." It sounded like a threat. Margaret's hands had shaken when she read the investigator's report. A threat. Claire had threatened their father. Susan filed an amended petition, including this evidence. Claire's attorney immediately moved to have it excluded, arguing it was hearsay. The judge allowed it, but noted that it was relatively weak. One neighbor's interpretation of an argument overheard through an open window. The case was set for trial in March. 4 months of depositions and document review and mounting legal bills. Margaret was spending $50,000 she didn't have. David couldn't afford his share, so Margaret covered him too. She took out a loan against her home equity, paid her attorney with money meant for her son's college. Her marriage was suffering. Her husband Rick had been supportive at first, but as the obsession deepened, he'd started pulling away. "You're destroying yourself over this," he'd said one night in January. "Maybe your father did want Claire to have more. Maybe you need to accept that." "He was manipulated," Margaret had insisted. "I know my father. He wouldn't do this." "Did you know him?" "He visited once a week. Claire was with him every day, for months. Maybe she knew him better at the end than you did. That had hurt. Worse than anything Claire had done. By February, Margaret was barely sleeping. She'd walk through her apartment at night, reviewing documents, looking for the one piece of evidence that would break Claire's story. The smoking gun that would prove manipulation. She never found it, but she found something else. The discovery came from an unexpected source. Emma, Claire's 15-year-old daughter. Margaret's investigator had been told not to approach Emma directly, too risky, too likely to backfire. But Emma approached Margaret on her own. It was mid-February, a Thursday evening. Margaret was leaving her office when her phone rang from an unknown number. "Aunt Margaret, it's Emma." Margaret's heart had started pounding. "Emma? Hi. Are you okay? I need to talk to you. Not at home. Can you meet me somewhere?" They'd met at a Starbucks in White Plains. Emma had looked thin, stressed, older than 15. She'd sat across from Margaret with her hands wrapped around a hot chocolate she wasn't drinking. "Mom doesn't know I'm calling you," Emma said. "She'd kill me if she knew." "What's wrong?" Emma had taken a breath. "I heard her on the phone last week. She was talking to someone about the will, about the trial. She was laughing. She said she couldn't believe you were spending all that money trying to fight it. She said you were making it easy for her, because every month you're in court is another month she gets to live in the house and use Grandpa's money. She said by the time the trial was over, you'd have spent so much on lawyers that even if you won, you'd barely come out ahead." Margaret felt cold. Who was she talking to? "I don't know. A friend, maybe. Or a lawyer." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Aunt Margaret, I don't think Mom cared about Grandpa. I think she was just waiting for him to die so she could have his money." "Why do you say that?" "Because of the way she talked about him. When he was alive, when we were alone, she'd complain about how hard it was taking care of him, how disgusting it was, how she couldn't wait for it to be over. But when you or Uncle David came over, she'd act like this devoted daughter. It was like watching someone perform." "Did you ever hear her tell your grandfather what to put in his will?" Emma hesitated. "Not exactly, but she'd talk to him about how hard her life was, about how broke she was, about how scared she was about my future, about paying for college. She'd cry sometimes. I heard her once telling him that he was the only person who could save us, that David and you were fine, but we were drowning." "Did your grandfather seem upset by these conversations?" "He seemed sad, tired. He'd pat her hand and tell her not to worry, that he'd take care of everything." Emma wiped her eyes. "I thought it was sweet at the time. Now I think she was manipulating him." Margaret had reached across the table, taken Emma's hand. "Would you be willing to testify, to tell a court what you just told me?" Emma had gone pale. "I can't. She's my mom. I still have to live with her." "I know. I'm not asking you to destroy your relationship with your mother. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you saw. She'll never forgive me." "Emma, your grandfather wanted his estate divided fairly. He spent his whole life planning for it. Your mother convinced him to change everything in the last months of his life. If we don't fight this, his real wishes die with him." Emma had pulled her hand back. "I can't. I'm sorry. I just wanted you to know what I heard, so you'd know you were right. But I can't testify. Please, don't make me." She'd left before Margaret could respond. Margaret had sat in that Starbucks for another hour, turning Emma's words over in her mind. The girl had just handed her the case. A witness who'd heard Claire manipulating Raymond, who'd heard her laughing about the litigation, who could testify to the performance, the calculation behind the caregiving. But Emma wouldn't testify. And Margaret couldn't force a child to choose between her mother and justice. She had driven home that night, feeling defeated. She had evidence. Real evidence of manipulation. But it was locked inside a 15-year-old girl who was too scared to speak. Susan had been blunt when Margaret told her about the conversation. "Without Emma's testimony, this is still just your interpretation of your sister's behavior. We need her in court. She's a child. I can't do that to her. Then we're probably going to lose." The trial was 3 weeks away. Margaret didn't sleep the night before trial. She kept thinking about her father, about the last conversation she'd had with him 2 weeks before he died. He'd been weak, barely able to speak, but he'd held her hand and said, "I'm proud of you, Maggie. You turned out just like I hoped." If he'd meant to cut her out of his will, would he have said that? Would he have looked at her with such warmth? Or had Claire gotten to him after that conversation? Had she spent those final days working on him, convincing him that Margaret didn't need the inheritance, that Claire deserved more, that fairness meant taking care of the weakest child? The trial started on a Monday morning in March. Westchester County Surrogate's Court, a building Margaret had walked past 1,000 times without ever imagining she'd fight for her family inside it. Susan laid out their case methodically. She called Dr. Henning, Raymond, physician, and got him to admit he'd only spent 20 minutes examining Raymond before signing off on his mental competence. She called Patricia Drummond, the neighbor, who testified about the argument she'd overheard. She introduced Claire's debt records, showing she'd been in financial crisis before moving in with Raymond. She called David to testify about how close their family had been before Claire took over their father's care, about how they'd been blocked from seeing Raymond in his final weeks, about the phone call from the police, and she called Margaret. Margaret sat in the witness box and told the court about her father, about his obsession with fairness, about the first will and how carefully he'd planned it, about the fear in his eyes near the end when Claire was always in the room. "My father was a careful man," Margaret sighed. "He didn't make impulsive decisions. The idea that he would completely rewrite his life's work in the final months of his life, giving virtually everything to one child, doesn't match the man I knew for 43 years. Claire's attorney, a sharp woman named Karen Moss, cross-examined with precision. "You visited your father once a week during his final months. Is that correct?" "Yes." "How long were these visits typically?" "A few hours." "And Claire lived with him 24 hours a day?" "Yes." "Yes. So out of 168 hours in a week, you spent 3 or 4 with your father. Claire spent the other 164. Is that a fair assessment?" Margaret had felt the trap, I suppose. "Is it possible that in those 164 hours, Claire got to know your father in ways you didn't? That she understood what he wanted at the end of his life better than you did?" "It's possible, but..." "And you've testified that your father was proud of you, that you had successful careers and financial security. Would you say that's accurate?" "Yes." "Whereas Claire was struggling financially, raising a daughter alone, working low-wage jobs?" "Yes." "So if your father wanted to help the child who needed it most, that would be Claire?" "Correct." "I suppose, but the question is whether he actually wanted that, or whether she convinced him. He wrote a letter explaining his reasoning." "You heard that letter. He specifically said Claire needed the inheritance more than you and David." "Those were his words, not hers." Margaret had no answer to that. The trial lasted 5 days. Susan called 8 witnesses. Karen called 12, including 3 of Raymond's former colleagues who testified he'd always talked about wanting to help Claire more. A physical therapist who said Raymond spoke frequently about how grateful he was for Claire's care. And Mitchell Browning, who walked the court through every step he'd taken to ensure Raymond was competent when he signed the new will. The testimony that hurt most came from Claire herself. She sat in the witness box, looking exhausted and sad. She talked about moving into her father's house, about learning to help him to the bathroom, about sitting with him at night when he was scared of dying, about how isolating it had been, how hard, how she'd given up her own life to make his final months bearable. "I didn't manipulate him," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I loved him. I took care of him when no one else would. And yes, he decided to leave me more than my siblings. But that was his choice, his decision. I never asked for it. I never suggested it. He came to that conclusion on his own because he saw what I was sacrificing." "Did you ever threaten your father?" Susan asked on cross-examination. "No." The neighbor testified she heard you say, "If you don't take care of me, I don't know what I'll do." "Do you remember saying that?" "I might have said something like that. But not as a threat. I was expressing how scared I was about my future. About Emma's future. I was confiding in my father, not threatening him." "You made multiple calls the day before the will was changed." "To the lawyer, to..." De doctor. Tu. De notary. Doesn't that suggest you were orchestrating this change? It suggests I was helping my father arrange the legal work he needed done. He'd told me he wanted to update his will. I helped him coordinate it. That's what a caregiver does. Susan pressed harder, but Claire didn't break. She cried at the right moments, looked indignant at the right accusations, played the devoted daughter who was being persecuted by wealthy siblings who couldn't accept their father's final wishes. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Alice Corrigan. She'd sat through the trial, making careful notes, asking occasional questions. On the final day, after closing arguments, she announced she'd take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 30 days. Margaret walked out of the courthouse feeling hollow. Susan tried to be encouraging, but they both knew the case was weak. They had suspicion but not proof. They had coincidence, but not evidence of actual manipulation. The problem, Susan said, as they stood on the courthouse steps, is that everything Claire did could be interpreted two ways. Either she was a devoted daughter, caring for her father, or she was a calculating manipulator, positioning herself for an inheritance. And the law presumes competence. Unless we can prove your father was manipulated, his will stands. So we lose. We might. I'm sorry, Margaret. I wish I had better news. Margaret had gone home that night and told Rick she wanted to withdraw the case, to stop fighting, to accept that maybe her father had chosen this and she needed to respect that choice. I think that's wise, Rick had said gently, but she couldn't do it. Some part of her still believed in the father she'd known, the man who'd taught her fairness, who'd said all his children were equal, who'd promised them all security. That man wouldn't have done this unless Claire had broken him down, unless in those final frightened months she'd convinced him that love meant giving her everything. The ruling came on a Thursday afternoon in April, exactly 28 days after trial ended. Susan called Margaret at work. We lost. Margaret had closed her office door, sat down. Tell me. Judge Corrigan found that Raymond was competent when he changed the will, that Claire's care constituted reasonable grounds for his decision to leave her a larger share, that while the timing was suspicious, suspicion isn't enough to overturn a person's final wishes. The will stands. What about the neighbor's testimony? The threats. She called it ambiguous, said it could have been interpreted multiple ways, and wasn't sufficient evidence of undue influence. What about Claire's debts? The timing of her moving in. She noted those facts, but said they didn't prove manipulation. People in financial crises often take caretaking roles. That doesn't mean they manipulate the people they care for. Margaret felt numb. So, that's it. You can appeal. But I'll be honest, Margaret, I don't think we'd win. The standard for overturning a will is very high. We'd need new evidence, something we didn't present at trial. Like Emma. Margaret hung up and sat in her office for an hour. Then she called David. We lost, she said. David was quiet for a long time. I'm going to be okay, he finally said. The job isn't great, but it's steady. I'll survive. I'm sorry. I thought we could win. You tried. That's more than a lot of people would have done. He paused. Do you think Dad really wanted this? Margaret thought about that question, the one she'd been avoiding for months. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe at the end, he did. Maybe Claire convinced him, and maybe he went along because he was tired and sick and she was the one there. Maybe that's all it takes to change a person's mind. Constant presence. Constant pressure. Maybe he did want to take care of her more. But you don't believe that? No, I don't. I think she manipulated him. I think she saw an opportunity. And she took it. And I think he was too weak to fight back. We'll never know for sure. No, we won't. They hung up. Margaret started the process of withdrawing the case and accepting the will as valid. She signed documents, paid final legal bills. Watch Claire officially inherit $4 million. Well, she and David each received $50,000 and some books and coins they didn't want. The estate closed in May. Claire sold the house in June for $820,000. She moved with Emma to a condo in Connecticut, paid cash. She quit her retail job. She put Emma in private school. She never spoke to Margaret or David again. 2 years later, Emma called Margaret again. It was late on a Sunday night in July. Margaret almost didn't answer the unknown number, but something made her pick up. "Aunt Margaret, it's Emma. I'm 17 now. I'll be 18 in 2 months. Emma, it's good to hear from you. How are you?" "I'm okay. I'm going to college next year. Boston University. Early admission." "That's wonderful." There was a long pause. "I wanted to tell you something. Something I should have told you during the trial, but I was too scared." Margaret's heart rate picked up. "Okay." "I heard Mom on the phone about a month before Grandpa died. She was talking to someone. I don't know who. She was in her room and I was in the hallway. She said, 'He's going to change it this week. Mitchell's coming Tuesday.' I made sure he understands what Ray wants." Then she laughed and said, "What Ray wants is what I've been telling him. He wants for 3 months." Margaret closed her eyes. "I wanted to testify," Emma continued, her voice shaking. "I wanted to help you, but I was 15, and she was my mom, and I didn't know what would happen if I went against her. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's okay, Emma. You were a child. I'm not anymore. In 2 months, I'll be 18. I'll be a legal adult, and I want to testify now. I want to tell what I heard. I don't care if she hates me. She's changed since Grandpa died. She's not the same person. The money made her mean." Margaret felt a complicated mix of emotions: vindication, grief, and something darker, the knowledge that, even if Emma testified now, it was too late. The estate was closed. The will had been executed. The money was spent. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "I appreciate you telling me this. I do. But the case is over. Even if you testified now, we can't reopen it. The statute of limitations has passed, so she just gets away with it." "Yes, she does." Emma was crying. "I'm sorry. I should have been braver. You are 15. You don't owe me an apology. You don't owe anyone anything." They talked for another few minutes. Emma asked about Margaret's sons. Margaret asked about college plans. They promised to stay in touch, though both knew they probably wouldn't. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her kitchen for a long time. Rick found her there at midnight, staring at nothing. "You're okay?" he asked. Emma called. She heard Claire coaching Dad on what to say for the will. She heard her planning the whole thing. Rick sat down across from her. "I'm sorry. I was right. I was right the whole time and I couldn't prove it. Some things can't be proven. That doesn't make them less true." Margaret looked at her husband. "Do you think people can just get away with that? Just manipulate and lie and steal and face no consequences? Sometimes, yeah, that's not fair. No, it's not." Margaret never spoke to Claire again. She saw her once, 3 years after the trial, at a charity event in Manhattan. Claire had looked expensive. Designer clothes, professional makeup, the kind of polish that comes from money and time. She'd been with a man, younger, handsome, laughing at something he'd said. Their eyes had met across the room. Claire had smiled. A small, knowing smile. Then she turned away. Margaret had left the event early, went home and opened the box where she kept her father's first edition books, the ones he'd left her in the will. She picked up a copy of East of Eden, his favorite Steinbeck, opened Italiano, inside the cover, in her father's handwriting from decades earlier. For Maggie, who always sees clearly, "Love, Dad." She'd sat with that book for hours, wondering if he'd forgotten he'd written that. Wondering if at the end, his vision had clouded, if Claire had been the one seeing clearly and Margaret had been blind, or if he'd known exactly what was happening and been too tired, too sick, too afraid of dying alone to fight it. David moved to Seattle the following year. He married a woman he met at his corporate architecture job. They had a daughter. He never mentioned the inheritance. On the rare occasions Margaret talked to him, they discussed other things. Work, family, the weather. They never discussed Claire. Emma went to Boston University. She graduated with honors. She got a job in publishing in New York. She called Margaret once a year, on Raymond's birthday. They'd talk for a few minutes. Emma would ask if Margaret had forgiven Claire. Margaret would say she didn't know. Emma would say she hadn't either. The inheritance had been paid. The will had been executed. The money had been distributed according to Raymond Thornhill's final wishes, witnessed and notarized and upheld by a court of law. And Margaret spent the rest of her life wondering if those wishes had ever really been his at all. The house in Scarsdale, where she'd grown up, was torn down by the new owners. They built something modern in its place. The rose garden, where her father collapsed, was paved over for a 3-car garage. The study where they'd reviewed the first will become someone else's home office. All of it gone. All of it changed. Just like the will that was supposed to protect them all. Changed in the final days. Changed when no one was watching carefully enough. Changed by a daughter who saw an opportunity and took it. Margaret kept one thing from the estate, besides the books. A photograph from her father's desk. All 3 children, years ago, maybe 12 and 9 and 5 years old. Smiling at the camera, Raman's hand on Margaret's shoulder. Claire in the middle, gap-toothed, and laughing, back when they were still a family. Back before money turned into a weapon. She keeps that photograph in her desk drawer. She doesn't look at it often, but she knows it's there, a reminder of what was lost. Not just the inheritance, everything else.